how did Joseph Smith manage to pick from all of these different contexts that he maybe could have, been exposed to in a lot of cases, but there's no real evidence that he was in some cases. How did he pick all that out and put them into a coherent system that would have been to one degree, or to some significant degree, sort of comfortable in this sort of early Jewish Christian milieu, right? How did he pull that off? Right?
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Okay, so here's another one. Christopher Stead, he was Anglican clergy and taught at um, the Cambridge Divinity School. He says, the Hebrews pictured the God whom they worshiped as having a body and mind like our own, though transcending humanity in the splendor of his appearance, in his power, his wisdom, and the constancy of his care for his creatures. Okay. And I have a couple passages. One's from Acts, right? Where Stephen sees the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. So, like, anthropomorphic, yes.
Right.
And then here's another one from the Clementine Homilies. That's sort of a sister document to the Clementine Recognitions. Similar type of group must have produced it from similar material. But in there, Simon Magus is asking, do you really believe God is in the shape of man? And Peter's like, yes, that's true. The man is in the shape of God. Not
Right.
not God is in the shape of man. Man is in the shape of God.
Mm. Like, yeah, we take it quite literally, being the image and likeness of God. And then I know Christians tend to reinterpret the passages in the Old Testament of prophets who speak with God face to face. They tend to see it as more poetic, but it seems that the ancient Jews and also early Christians had this view of God as anthropomorphic, and that one statement that we're made in his shape or in his image.
Yeah. And it's not like we don't take anything in the scriptures as a metaphor or something like that, right? We
Yeah,
don't
sure.
Nobody interprets everything literally, right? But what was taken literally shifted in this
Yes, that's a good
transition.
point.
Okay, so this is a couple quotes from a couple Middle Platonist philosophers talking about what God is. Like this one, Socrates and Plato held that God is the one, the single self-existent nature, the monadic, the real being, the good, and all this variety of names points immediately to mind. God, therefore, is mind, a separate species, that is to say, what is purely immaterial and unconnected with anything passible, which passible just means changeable.
Right.
Okay, so and more of the same from Numenius. Um,
So
so
this is
so this is
Greek
the intellectual climate
philosophers'
that
definition of God.
that yeah, yes. All right. And so now in the second century and third century, you start getting Christian theologians who will straight up say, we believe in the God of the Father, at least, is the God of the philosophers. So here's Tertullian saying, whatever attributes, therefore, you require as worthy of God must be found in the Father, who is invisible and unapproachable and placid, and so to speak, the God of the philosophers. Whereas those qualities which you censure as unworthy must be supposed to be in the Son. So they still think of God the Father as the one of the philosophers. Okay, now this one is especially telling. Okay, this is Origen. Um, so early third century. Okay, is like the greatest Christian theologian to that time. He says the Jews indeed, but also some of our people, so Jewish Christians basically, suppose that God should be understood as a man, that is adorned with human members and human appearance. But the philosophers despise these stories as fabulous and formed in the likeness of poetic fictions.
That's
So
a good
just
quote.
metaphors, like you said. Yeah. So and so Origin, he why does he dismiss this idea that God is anthropomorphic, even though the Jews, which the Christians came from, and the Jewish Christians, which like were the first Christians, right? Um, even though that's what they believed, well, the philosophers despise these stories, right? So he's going to dismiss it. Okay. So that's step number one is we
Right.
replace
So
the
the
Father.
definition of God to the Greek philosophers is sort of like out of time, out of space, immaterial, omnipresent, and
Yeah.
unchangeable in a way,
With
and that they
without
were
with without body parts or passions, like the
yes,
Westminster Confession says, right?
right, yes, and that's how they're understanding, or at least at this point, God the Father, they're viewing as this Greek philosophy view or conception of God.
Yes. Okay. And and Jesus was sort of thought of during this time as like on the more Jewish Christian side, just like the chief angel, right? But you could also call him God. He was like a second God. Okay. And as it got more influenced by the Greek philosophy, maybe they would think of him as sort of an emanation from God. That's what Tertullian thought, right? But he was still lesser than God the Father, right? But you could call him God because it was an emanation. There's a lot of change going on during this time. Okay. Now, so the next step occurred around, it was occurring at the same time, but I think of it as the next logical step was a change in how the material world was viewed, right? Um, because the older view was that it was created out of unformed matter, right? So that's what we believe, right? So matter is eternal, spirit is eternal, right? So God created stuff like you would create a house or something. You find some materials and you make something out of it, right? That's actually what the Greek philosophers thought too. But the scholars who study this stuff, um, for the most part, will say it looks like nobody even thought of this idea of creation out of absolute nothingness until the second century AD. Okay. And so here I have some quotes. This one's from Justin Martyr, so about 150 AD or so, um, talking about God creating out of unformed matter. And then here's a couple passages from Genesis, and this is the New English Bible translation. It's a little clearer. Um, it's talking about God creating out of some watery chaos, right? So it assumes sort of a prior um, existence of the material to build from, right?
Right.
Um, anyway, so uh, the first person who really clearly said um, God created out of nothingness, and not no, not nothing how we usually say it, like, oh, that's nothing, right? But it's really something, we just don't care about it. It's not anything that matters, right? No, really nothingness, absolute nothingness.
Like nothing existed.
Yeah, was a Gnostic Christian named Basilides, and his idea was that um, um, God created the material, or not God, but some emanation from God that was not God, because God wouldn't create this evil material world. Something else had to in
Right, because
between.
they saw the material world as evil, so it was some sort
But
of
anyway,
evil
but it
god.
couldn't have existed always like God has, because it's um, yeah, it's evil, right? Okay. And but then some Christian theologians started latching onto this as an argument against the Gnostics, because remember, if the material world is evil, then how could it have come from um, God? So the regular Christians that were maybe influenced by Greek philosophies, but otherwise were pretty normal, right? Um, they were trying to say, look, if it came out from God, then it couldn't be inherently evil, right? So if God created it from nothing, that's actually a good argument against the Gnostics. So that's why they adopted it according to the scholars. This is one Edwin Hatch, the influence of Greek ideas and usages upon the Christian church. So it starts being adopted by Christian theologians in the late second century. Okay, so This causes problems, though, for Christians that they need to solve, and it takes hundreds of years to solve this. Okay. If God created everything from absolute nothingness, everything fits into two categories: things that are self-existent, which only includes God, right? And things that are contingent or created from nothing, which is everything else. Okay. So if that's how we're dividing things up, where do the Son and the Spirit fit in? Because the Christians had always been teaching that, we worship God the Father, but also the Son and the Spirit, right? And they thought of them as sort of lower in rank than the Father, but still divine, right?
Right. And they're probably thinking like if they were created or contingent, how could we worship them?
Yeah. So now this Greek idea of God, it's a there's a term called divine simplicity. Like you can look it up on Wikipedia, even if someone wants to learn more about it. But the idea is that whatever this divine essence is, this Greek idea of the divine essence, it is it has no parts, right? It can't be divided in any way. It's completely homogeneous throughout. And there's a whole train of logic for why supposedly it has to be that way. But anyway, that's how they thought of it. But if that's true, there can't be any divisions in the divine substance. Does that mean that the Son and the Spirit are like created out of nothing? So they're not really God. They're not like there's this huge gulf between what's really God and sort of these subsidiary beings that are created from nothing. Um, so that's where all the arguments from the next several hundred years about how to believe about the Trinity and about what how was Jesus really a man then, if he was this Greek Platonic thing. Um, that all comes from this juxtaposition of the the doctrine that God has to be this essence that they talked about, and the doctrine that God created everything out of absolute nothingness.
Hmm. And this essence that's like omnipresent, like everywhere, and like you said, it can't be divided.
Yeah. So remember I was talking about how mainstream Christian theologians nowadays are adamant that they're three distinct persons, but in such a way that the essence isn't divided, right? Because the essence can't be divided, otherwise it wouldn't be the divine essence, right?
Yeah, because the Father's
By
not the
this,
Son, the Son's not the Father, the Holy Spirit isn't the Father or the Son. They're different persons, but one being. An analogy I thought of is from Harry Potter, the first movie with Fluffy, the three-headed
Mhm.
dog. It's like it's one dog, but it's three distinct heads. I think that's actually a good analogy for it. Um, I don't think it really works intellectually for me, but
Well, it doesn't. Like even the theologians who buy into this would say, okay, that's an okay metaphor, but it's not all the way there because, of course, a head is a part of the body, right? But the divine essence doesn't have any parts. That's what we're saying. And yet somehow
yeah,
there are these three persons. So like in for hundreds of years they had different councils that ironed the stuff out, and so they would say things like okay, what's the relationship between the three persons? Well, the Son is the only begotten of the Father, so let's say he's eternally begotten from the Father. What does that mean? We don't know. Okay, but and the Spirit, he's not God's only begotten Son, so he must be have a different relationship with the Father. So maybe he proceeds from the Father. They would use that kind of word. Okay. What does procession mean? Well, we don't know. Okay. So it's supposed to be a mystery that's too, you know,
too complex for human
yeah,
understanding or
we human
comprehension.
brains will short circuit. And which fine, right? I totally believe there's things about the universe and about God that my brain would short circuit if I tried to understand it because I've tried to understand quantum mechanics, So it's I get it. It's out of our league, but at the same time, can you really expect people to believe something where they can say certain words, but they don't know what all those words mean? You know what I mean? So that's why you talked about somebody saying, "Oh, well, you really have to be a Christian, um, or to be a Christian, you really have to believe in the Trinity doctrine,
Right.
right?" And I'm like, what exactly are you believing? You're believing a set of words and some concepts, but then some concepts are in the words that you don't know what those words mean, and so you can't believe something you don't know what it means. You see what I mean?
And it's also not taught in the New Testament clearly. I know they'll point to passages that Christians think support the Trinity, but my understanding is the consensus of New Testament scholars is that the early Christians didn't believe in this, form of the Trinity that later became, codified in centuries later.
Yeah. And you can actually track the details, pretty closely
You can
through
see
that
the
evolution.
development. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So one aspect of this is that the Christians had always believed that Jesus and the Spirit are subordinate to the Father in rank and glory, right?
Right.
So, um, so this is a Anglican scholar, RPC Hansen. He says, indeed, until Athanasius began writing, every single theologian, East and West, had postulated some form of subordinationism. It could, about the year 300, have been described as a fixed part of Catholic theology. And here, this is just a quote, a selection of quotes from Justin Martyr around 150 AD. Okay. He's calling Jesus the first begotten, the first force after the Father. He's a second God. He actually used the words deuteros theos.
Oh, well.
Um, Second numerically, but not in will, right? So they're one in will, right? Is what they're saying.
Which is more in line with our understanding
Yeah,
conception of
yes, exactly.
relationship between the
They
Father and the Son.
yeah. He says this power which the prophetic word calls God and angel. So lots of Christian theologians in say the second century or so, and even in the third century, were comfortable calling Jesus and the Holy Spirit like both God and an angel, right? They sort of could use those terms.
And they
Uh,
also weren't strict monotheists, the early Christians or the ancient Jews.
yeah, like so there are some scholars that say no, they weren't monotheists. There are other scholars who say, well, they said they believed in one God, so let's call them monotheists, but what they meant by it is different than what people mean nowadays. Okay. So, and we could say the same thing. Do we believe there's one God? Yes, the Book of Mormon says so, right? The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, one eternal God, right? And Second Nephi 31, I think. Um, so, so in some sense, they're one, right?
Yes.
But not in the sense of being the same being. They didn't. The only people who believe that and say that, like in the late second century, you had modalists popping up, and they got beaten down, right? Because they're basically saying that the Father was crucified, right, and died, and so that's like they that went out of fashion. So by the time of the Council of Nicaea, that was not in fashion anymore, and everyone up to that time, besides the modalists, had basically believed the Father, the Son, and the Spirit were subordinate to the Father in rank and glory,
That seems
even
that
though
John
they
17
could
explains quite
legitimately be
well
called God.
the
I'm sorry,
unity
what you
and the
said?
oneness of the Father and the Son. John 17 seems to explain it quite well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. In fact, that's the only passage in the Bible that talks about how God is one, right? There's passages that say God is one, right? There's one God or whatever, or the only true God or whatever. But John 17 is the only passage that talks at all about how God is one because it says Jesus is praying for his followers to be one with each other as he is one with the Father, and he prays for them to be one in him and the Father in the same way, right?
Yes.
So whatever type of oneness is available for us with each other and with God, that's the type of oneness that is between the Father and the Son, right? That's how I read the passage anyway.
Yeah, so we believe like we can almost be described sometimes as like social Trinitarians that we
Yeah,
believe like socially they are, completely united. I think there's that talk by Elder Jeffrey R. Holland he gave years ago at General Conference where he's like, we believe they're one in purpose, in will, like in every way we believe they're united and harmonious, except in being, that we don't believe that they are the same being or substance.
yeah, and I dug out several passages from Brigham Young too, where he talked about it, and he was saying, "Are we going to be like if when we become gods or whatever, are we going to be independent from our Father? No, we're not. The gods are one, right? So they're kind of deep passages from Brigham Young, but talking about how the idea basically, I think he was translating the King Follett discourse into this idea of like there's one God, but it consists of all the beings who are one, right? So um, anyway, so it's just a different way of approaching this problem that um, I think became unavailable or less available or more problematic for Christians once they bought into the idea that there's two categories, God and everything else that was created from nothing, and they had to decide where to put Jesus, right?
Right. Because I guess as well, this would have been a time of this belief in creation out of nothing, that there was God and then everything else was contingent or created. That would also throw out a belief in a premortal existence as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, you could create the spirits out of nothing and then put them in bodies, right? I
Oh,
guess.
sure. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, it becomes more problematic anyway.
Mm,
Uh,
right.
all right. So anyway, I'm just quoting passages here from both the New Testament um, that show, you know, and from other early Christian writers uh, saying, you know, Jesus and the Spirit are subordinate to the Father. They're not on the same level in certain respects. Okay, so that brings us to and like I'm sorry if I'm yakking too much and taking too much
No, this
time.
is good.
Okay, so the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, and its aftermath. And I say and its aftermath because we think of this as um, this event where they hammered out the Nicene Creed. But even after they hammered out the Nicene Creed, everyone didn't agree about what it meant. And so there, over hundreds of years, they had several other councils that hammered out more details and quashed certain views and so on. Okay. So at the Council of Nicaea, you can sort of divide the people there into three groups. One of them was the Arians. So if God's the one of the philosophers or the divine substance, there is no way he could have become incarnate, suffered, and died. Therefore, Jesus must have been a created being. So
Because they
not,
view God as impassible, unchangeable.
yeah, so God the Father is the one of the philosophers, and Jesus is a being that was created out of nothing. Maybe like a super archangel type of being, but still created out of nothing. Okay. And then the Athanasians, or sometimes they're called the Nicenes because they won, right? But that led by Athanasius. Um, they said, well, Jesus is God, so he must somehow be, and I have like part of crossed out because that's not exactly what they're saying.
Because you can't really have parts of the divine
Yeah,
substance.
there are no parts. The divine substance. So the Trinity is the divine substance, which is completely homogeneous and indivisible, but there are three distinct persons which comprise the divine substance in such a way that there is no division in the substance. And they said the persons are homoousios, which means of one substance, okay, with each other. And they took this word to mean like the divine substance, right? Which can't be divided. See what I mean? So when they say they are one substance, they're saying the Father, Son, and Son are both this divine substance somehow.
I'm really, when you think about the Trinity in some ways, there's a lot of to similarities in understanding of the Godhead in terms of believing that they're distinct persons. We believe they're distinct persons,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you know their unity that they have, but we believe distinct persons and distinct beings. But I guess as well because of this influence of Greek philosophy and the philosophical understanding of God as being like everywhere, everything, this essence,
yeah.
they can't be with this Greek philosophical understanding of God distinct as a substance. So they're trying to find a way of like, well, scripture, we clearly have three different persons, but they're trying to fit it into somehow they're one substance because of this Greek philosophical understanding of the nature of God, which we wouldn't believe is really biblical.
Yes, right. So so they painted themselves into a corner here with this. But if you understand all these details, it's like it's easier to have a conversation and figure out exactly what any particular person believes about it and why, if you have some basic understanding about why they would believe certain
I
things,
feel like I
right?
have empathy. I always appreciate that they're trying to harmonize it with the philosophy and the intellectual understanding of God at the time with what it's saying in the New Testament. So I appreciate that they're trying to find some sort of way to harmonize this.
Yeah. And like I said, we do this kind of thing all the time, right?
Yeah.
Um, at, but I would say it's definitely when you're trying to do that kind of thing, I think it's good and necessary and to think about that kind of stuff and play with ideas about how the like the religious stuff and the scientific or intellectual stuff is related. But you always have to like be a little cautious about it, right? Because number one, it's going to change.
Mm.
And we believe the religion might change to some extent too. We get more revelations and have to reinterpret some of the prior stuff, right? And we get more information as far as natural observations and stuff, and we have to reinterpret uh, all of it in terms of a new theory in science, right? So you got to be careful. I mean, but it's good to think about. But these guys, I think the problem is like so when Jesus or when Heavenly Father and Jesus appeared to Jesus, they told or appeared to Joseph Smith, sorry. They they said that like in Christianity, all their creeds are an abomination, right? And I've heard Christians push back on that and say, oh, well, what like they put the Nicene Creed in there and they say, what do you have a problem with the creed? And it's not so much that we don't believe anything in those creeds. Most of the time we can find a lot to agree with in the creeds that Christianity has adopted. But but what I think the problem is they have the creeds sort of incorporate this one particular type of intellectual framework which is not current nowadays for sure, right? And say, okay, we have to interpret, say, the scriptures and everything in light of this, and we can't change this from now on, right? The creeds are set in stone, which is totally antithetical about that to how Joseph Smith thought about religion, for instance.
Very expansive view.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So
It's
now there
because they're
was
quite limiting the creeds. I just have a quick question on this. I know I don't want to spend too long on this, but what if a Christian were to say, like, how much of the Nicene Creed and defining the Trinity as three persons, one being, how much is influenced by this Greek philosophical understanding of the nature of God versus, Christians would point to passages in the Bible that talk about there only being one God, such as like in the book of Isaiah, like before me there was no God, neither after me there only is one God. So they might say that, oh, well, they're trying to harmonize it with the Bible, not so much Greek philosophy.
Um, so yeah, Christians have always had the problem of in the New Testament, it talks about three different, like, it seems like clearly separate persons, right? Who are all referred to as God, right? Um, and so we have and also in the New Testament they repeat some Old Testament statements about there being one God, right? So the question is, and has always been, how is that true, right?
How to
And so
reconcile it.
and so what I would say to people is like we agree with you that there is one God in a certain sense, and that sense is different than the sense you think there's one God, right? Um, but those words we can say in complete confidence.
Right.
Okay.
And the ancient Israelites, my understanding of biblical scholarship is they weren't strict monotheists in the sense they did worship one God, Yahweh, but they also believed in a divine council or that there are other deities as well.
Yeah. And you have the Christians, the earliest Christians linked like the angel of the Lord's presence. So when um, God was speaking to Moses, he said, "Okay, I'm going to send you my angel, and my name is in him." So he gave him the divine name, right? So the early Christians uh, connected him with that, or connected Jesus with that being, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, there were more than one divine being clearly in the Old Testament, but we were supposed to worship the one, and still we would say, okay, we worship the Father um, uh, through the Son, or like in the name of the Son through the Holy Ghost, or something like that, right? So it's we don't sort of worship the Holy Spirit separately or something like that, or whatever. It's all
Right,
worshiping, going all in the same direction.
right. That's good.
Okay, but at Nicaea, most of the people there is this is what J.N.D. Kelly, he's Anglican scholar again. Um, he called the Great Conservative Middle Party, and he said its positive doctrine is that there are three divine hypostases, which is Greek word for persons, basically, separate in rank and glory, but united in harmony of will. Okay, so this was still the main doctrine. So what ended up happening is like this word homoousios, so of one substance, that word had been in use for quite a long time, but the meaning of the word before was um, the same kind of thing. Like this horse is homoousios with this other horse because they're the same kind of thing, right? So if you say the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are of one substance, so homoousios with each other, that means they're the same kind of thing. Okay. So they were okay with using that word, even though they didn't mean it in the same way that Athanasius's party meant. Okay. Some of them even suggested using this other word, homoousios, which means like of a similar substance, right? But that sounded too Arian, too close to the Arians, right?
Hmm.
So So they rejected that. And then gradually this view of the middle party got stamped out over hundreds of years. Okay. Until it was all like the official belief was what Athanasius party basically was pushing. Okay. Okay, so this I mentioned this before about how are the persons of the Trinity related to each other. The Son's eternally begotten. The Spirit proceeds from either the Father. Like at first they said that he proceeds from the Father, but then later on the Roman Catholics said he proceeds from the Father and the Son. And that's actually part of the reason why the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics split apart, right? But to put it in perspective, though, listen to this one. This is from the fourth century Gregory of Nazianzus. He's one of the great Orthodox Christian theologians. So he's arguing with people about this language in the creeds. He says, the Holy Ghost, which proceedeth from the Father, inasmuch as he proceedeth from that source, is no creature, and inasmuch as he is not begotten, is no son. So he's not the same relationship as the Son is. And inasmuch as he is between the unbegotten and the begotten, is God. And thus, escaping the toils of your syllogisms, he has manifested himself as God, stronger than your divisions. What then is procession? Do you tell me what the unbegottenness of the Father, and I will explain to you the physiology of the generation of the Son and the procession of the Spirit, and we shall both of us be frenzy stricken for prying into the mystery of God. So he's basically saying, nobody knows what these words mean. The procession, the Holy Ghost proceeds, and yet they're arguing over this and splitting up church, putting divisions in the church over whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father or from the Father and the Son, right? When they don't even know what proceeds mean or what it means for the Son to be eternally begotten. Okay.
Right. It's just
So,
language.
yeah. Okay. And like I said before, eventually they came like, what does that do about if Jesus then is truly God, right? He's involved with this divine substance, right? Um, how could he have truly been man? Because you can't be a real Christian, right, without thinking Jesus really became a man and atoned for us through his death and resurrection and all that, right? So like I said, their solution was that, oh, he has two natures. One is the God nature, and the other one is a complete human soul. Okay, soul and body. Okay, and that's sort of connected in such a way that it doesn't make Jesus two people. I put that in all caps there because it's like, how are they not two different people if he has a human mind and a body, and also there's this divine substance that's totally unchanging,
Yeah, so
right?
it's like he has two minds.
Yeah, how but they'll say no, 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 no. Not so it doesn't make two minds, it's one mind, but so once again, they're just in territory where, like, if it's true, the human brain cannot process it. And so they're just saying word salad that they're saying is pointing us in the right direction, I guess, but we can't understand it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, like because there's a verse that Jesus talks about, like with regards to his second coming, that no man knoweth the hour, not even the Son, but the Father alone. And if he is fully God, then how could he not know? Like, 'cause if he's fully God, is the same substance and the same nature as the Father, and the Greek philosophical view of God is unchangeable or impassible, how could he not know something?
Yeah. So the earlier Christians would have said they did cite that passage and say, "Oh, see, this shows that the Son is subordinate to the Father."
Right, the
Right.
Father's the most high God.
Yeah, yeah. But later they're like wrestling with, well, how do we put all this together now that we decided that Jesus is one being with the Father?
Hmm.
Okay. So once they've adopted all that, like, more questions are brought up, right? So how related, like, so we say, we talk about deification in the church, right? Like men can become gods, right? And that was all over in early Christianity. But
It's
if you
crazy
talk,
that, isn't it? Because we're so attacked by Christians for that blasphemy and arrogance to think we could become like God. Like it's treated as heresy. And whenever I learned
yeah,
that, like we cite some passages in the New Testament, from Paul about becoming joint heirs with Christ, or in Revelations about sitting as Christ sits in his Father's throne, will sit on the throne. Oh, you've got a lot of those passages,
Yeah, but
um,
keep going. Yeah, keep
but
going.
it's
So we don't have
funny
to talk about it
whenever I
later.
learned about so many statements from early Christians about deification, it's kind of like the irony because we're so heavily criticized for it as Latter-day Saints, but that's what some of
Yeah.
the earliest Christians believed.
Yeah. And it's still something believed by Orthodox, and also like Catholics, but they don't emphasize it much at all, right?
Hmm.
But you can find language about it in the Catechism. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but this was something that, like, here I have this um, a couple passages from this Jesuit scholar, George Joyce, saying basically this deification doctrine clearly came from the apostles. And like by the time of like the fourth century, it was treated as something that no Christian would dream of denying, right? But the question is, what did they mean by it, right? So, so, so if you talk to somebody who's actually like, say, a Catholic or an Orthodox theologian or historian or somebody who is informed about all this stuff, the objection they'll say is that, yeah, they said men can become gods and all that kind of thing, but they didn't mean the same thing as you guys mean. Okay. And that is true, like at least for most of these Hellenized Christians, right? Because how could they mean the same thing as we do if they think of God as this essence that can't be duplicated, it can't be divided, it can't be added to, right? So how could we be really God in the same sense as that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he's the unmoved mover, the first cause, like omniscient, omnipresent, unchangeable. How could they become like God in that sense?
Yeah. So I think a key to understanding, like putting all those statements in context, is given by Gregory of Nazianzus, so late fourth century um, Catholic saint, that kind of guy. Um, he said, "I too might be made God so far as he is made man." So this gives us a key to interpreting the deification doctrine for different theologians. And that is, however man-like they think Jesus became, right? That's how God-like humans can become. Okay. Now, but like I said, in this sort of Greek philosophical context, like it's more limited, right? How close we can approach the one God, right? Whereas, well, in an earlier context that's I believe in more anthropomorphic type of God, then like that we could definitely get closer, right?
Mm,
Because Jesus becoming a man wasn't as big of a stretch as the one becoming Jesus the man. Do you see what I mean?
yeah.
So okay, so this is from the that Jewish Christian document, the Clementine Recognitions, and so this is Peter talking again. He says, after, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go straight to there. But anyway, do you get the idea? We already talked about anthropomorphism of God, right? So so in that kind of context, okay, we could imagine human deification coming closer to whatever God is, right?
Right.
Okay.
It's all connected. This Greek philosophy and this, believing that God created everything out of nothing, and then this loss of an anthropomorphic God. So therefore, not believing that humans can become deified, that
Yeah.
we're a
Well,
separate
not
species
really.
completely.
Like not in the same sense anyway.
Yeah.
Like the Orthodox will talk about being connected to God's energies or something like that, right? So so yeah. So maybe so think of it this way. If Jesus is the divine substance plus this complete human soul and body, right? That complete human soul and body, however close that approaches the divine essence, right? That's how close we can in
Right.
there,
And
right?
getting back to the question
So
of
the
like
man
apostasy,
Jesus, that's how
like well, you
close.
said at the start that there's many beliefs and doctrines we still agree with Christians. This is pretty foundational stuff, like the nature of God and the nature, our nature and our relationship to God and this ex nihilo creation. This is very foundational changes we can see in differences in our theology and our doctrine.
Yeah, exactly. So wanted to point out a couple other things. I have this is from Clementine recognition, so Jewish Christian context. Um, Talking about premortal existence. So after all these things, this Peter talking, after all these things, he made man on whose account he had prepared all things, whose internal species, meaning spirit, is older, and for whose sake all things that are were made. So, and this idea of a premortal existence of human spirits was pretty common in early Christianity. Um, but the situation became muddled reasonably quickly, and like here I have this quote by Origen, so early third century, and he's saying basically he actually believed in doctrine, a doctrine of preexistence. Um, but he's basically saying how human souls come into being and stuff like that is not a settled doctrine in the church right now. Some people say this, some people say that, and pre-existence was one of the options. Okay, but so the question is, how did if this is what the earliest Jewish Christians maybe thought, as represented by the Clementine recognitions, why did it go away? Why did it fade away relatively quickly? Um, and here's another passage here from the Clementine recognition. And this is where Peter's talking to Simon Magus, so the heretic, right? So remember, when you're talking to the heretics, you don't let on the secret stuff, right? You don't up and say everything. Maybe you talk around it. So he says to Simon, "You seem to me not to know what a father and a God is," because Simon was asking how human souls come into being. "But I could tell you both whence souls are and when and how they were made. But it is not permitted to me now to disclose these things to you who are in such error in respect of the knowledge of God." So what this tells me is that, okay, number one, when he was talking to Clement, so somebody who's initiated, right, he could tell them about the preexistence of souls, right? But when he's talking to an unbeliever, he's like, I could tell you all about that. And I guess you don't even know what a father and a God is, so that must have something to do with where our souls come from. But
Mm.
anyway, because you're this heretic and you can't handle it, right? Or you would do bad things with it or whatever. So this was part of the secret tradition. That's what I'm saying. This indicates, at least for this Jewish Christian group, this was part of the secret tradition that was not passed to everyone by the apostles. Okay. Now the Gnostics were all about the secret tradition, right? And once you say there's a secret tradition, it's easy for somebody to come in and say, "Hey, um, we've got it, and here it is," and it's all this crazy stuff about 365 heavens and the Ognode and whatever weird stuff the Gnostics believed. So I get it when people are hesitant and like think I'm trying to make a cop out here when I say, oh, this was probably a part of the secret tradition. But I only say that because this document says it was part of the secret tradition. Okay. And so remember at first I was talking about how this has a big link to what the apostasy was about. How did we lose so much information? Like how could it have happened? And part of it, the answer at least, is because of some of the things were secret and didn't get passed on in writing to people. And then the other answer is okay, they adopted this Greek philosophical intellectual framework and reinterpreted everything in that light. And so so that's basically the kind of stuff that was lost, right? Along with associated maybe rituals and stuff.
Right.
Okay, so anyway, here's another one. Uh, Epistle to Diognetus, so early second century. They Christians live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven, as the soul lives in the body, yet does not have its origin in the body. So the Christians live in the world; they are not of the world. But immortal, the soul lives in a mortal house. Blah blah. Okay, so yeah. Now back to deification. Remember, I said this is something that everybody believed, like all the Christians believed this in some sense back then. Um,
Those are
but
some New Testament passages that talk a little about deification.
yeah, so here's an important point to understand about this. Remember the key from Gregory of Nazianzus. However far God became man, that's how far man can become God. Okay. So now, if you pick up uh, J. and D. Kelly's Early Christian Doctrines, that the book, right? He talks about what it looks like, sort of the original Christology. He called a spirit Christology. Christology was okay. So he says what it looks like it was is that the Word, right, this divine being, or the Logos in Greek, uh, was put into a human body just like a human soul would be. Okay. So we see that in John, the Word was made flesh, right? Doesn't say the Word was made flesh plus a human spirit, just says the Word was made flesh. Says, and then Ignatius, so again, about 110 AD, he says, God the Word did dwell in a human body, being within it as the Word, even as the soul also is in the body, right? Um, and then this is Hippolytus, so about 200 AD or so. Um, so this logos or word we know to have received a body from a virgin. Okay, so here's the question I have for people: if the word is fundamentally so, Jesus's divine essence, whatever, is fundamentally different from a human soul, how can Jesus have been truly human? With this type of Christology, which was the earliest type of Christology. Okay. Um, so, but on the other hand, if the word is fundamentally similar to a human soul, then human deification involves becoming more similar to God than later theologians would have thought, right? So,
Oh, I
because
see.
the word was starting out as something that must have been really similar to a human soul, right? Otherwise, you stuff that into a meat puppet, that doesn't make it truly a man that can go through our experiences and atone for our sins and suffer and die and stuff like that, right?
Hmm.
Unless there's something fundamentally similar about these pre-existent human spirits and the pre-existent word that was Jesus. Okay. Okay. Now here's another example of cool stuff that we so remember salvation for the dead. That's an LDS thing, right? Like, if you ask different Christians, like Catholics nowadays, they used to say, if you're not baptized in the Catholic Church, you're damned or in limbo if you're a baby or something like that, right? Um, but nowadays, if you look at the catechism, it's like more vague about it, and there might be some way for people like who'd never heard of Christ or whatever to be saved through, and children and stuff like that. But whatever way it is, it's going to be through the church somehow. Okay, so they're very vague about it if they believe that, you know, in the people who aren't Christians in life can be saved. Okay,
And
but we
mainstream Protestant Christians definitely do not believe in salvation for the dead.
yeah, yeah. So our interpretation is based on these three passages from First Peter, where Peter talks about Jesus after he died going and preaching to the spirits in prison so that they could um, might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the spirit, right? Um, and then in 1 Corinthians 15:29, Paul is arguing like why you should believe in the resurrection, because they had these Gnostic types saying, no, Jesus was a hologram or whatever, who couldn't have been resurrected. How could the, who would want that back, right? Um, he says, else what thou shall they do which are baptized for the dead if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead? Now, like there's I found a scholar once who had tallied up like 200 and something different um, interpretations of this First Corinthians 15 verse, right? People trying to weasel out of the plain meaning of it, which is that okay? There were some people that the Corinthians were familiar with, at least, who were being baptized in behalf of the dead, and Paul is using that as an argument for the resurrection. But if it was some heretics or something that Paul didn't agree with, why would he use that as an argument for the resurrection?
Yeah, he
He
doesn't
would,
seem to be condemning it, and
yeah,
he seems to be
yeah.
referring that some Christians are at least doing this practice.
So most, scholars will say, yeah, there must have been somebody doing this, but doesn't mean Paul approved it, or it must have been talking about something else, or like there's all kinds of ways people get out of this. Okay. But anyway, if you go back in the early Christian literature, for a long time, that was just standard that yeah, Jesus went and preached to the spirits in Hades, right? In the bad part, and and then they would even say that the apostles did that after they died. Okay, so here's one from the pastor of Hermas. He says, these apostles and teachers who preached the name of the Son of God after falling asleep in the power and faith of the Son of God preached it not only to those who were asleep, but themselves also gave them the seal of the preaching, which was baptism. Accordingly, they descended with them into the water and again ascended. So baptisms in the spirit world. And now Clement of Alexandria, so maybe 180-ish, 190 AD, he says he quotes Hermas and he says, "Oh, well, the soul couldn't really interact with the material water, right? But but anyway, there had to be some kind of baptism involved, right? So so this the idea that like the people who were like heathens or whatever, never heard of Christ and so on and so forth and died, they could be evangelized after death, um, was totally standard. Okay. Uh, uh, Practically the Jewish Christians believed it. Here's some a passage from the Clementine Recognitions talking about the same thing. Um, he says, I think he's talking to Simon Magus again. He says, if those shall enjoy the kingdom of Christ, whom his coming shall find righteous, shall, oh no, I'm sorry. This is Clement talking to Peter, and then Peter's going to reply.
Hmm.
So he says, if those shall enjoy the kingdom of Christ, whom his coming shall find righteous, shall then those be wholly deprived of the kingdom who have died before his coming? So he's asking whether people who died before Jesus came can be saved too. And then Peter says, you compel me, O Clement, to touch upon things that are unspeakable. For so far as it is allowed to declare them, I shall not shrink from doing so. For not only shall they, the righteous dead, escape the pains of hell, but shall also remain incorruptible, and shall be the first to see God the Father, and shall obtain the rank of honor among the first in the presence of God. Um, but here's another passage later on in the Clementine Recognitions where Peter says, but so well pleasing is chastity to God that it confers some grace in the present life, even upon those who are in error. So he's saying it's good for people to be chaste, even if they believe the wrong things about God.
Hmm.
For but so it's good for them now. But for future blessedness is laid up for those only who preserve chastity and righteousness by the grace of baptism. That's another thing. All these guys except the Gnostics, basically, um, and probably not all the Gnostics, um, thought that baptism was necessary. Like John 3:5, born of water, you have to be born of water and of the Spirit. They all interpreted that to mean baptism.
And they interpret it as essential for salvation.
Yeah, that's what Jesus said. If he's talking about baptism, he says to enter the kingdom of God, you have to be born of the water and the Spirit, right? They all interpreted it that way, right? But at the same time, Peter is saying, "Oh, but these people who died before Jesus even came, they can be saved, and they can, be have places of honor in the presence of God." So how did they get their baptism? Well, he says, "You compel me, O Clement, to touch upon things that are unspeakable. But so far as it is allowed to declare them, I shall not shrink from doing so." So he's telling Clement, well, this is some of the secret stuff, but I can tell you a little bit of it, right? So now for baptism for the dead, like it's right there in the New Testament. But then after that, you see it popping up here and there, mentions of this group or that group doing that. Okay. And then nothing, right? So this is another case where, um, like it was like at least the Jewish Christians who wrote this Clementine recognitions thought it was part of the secret teaching, right? And but it's right there in the New Testament, even though it's not explained out. Um, this is another example of how something that was part of the secret teaching that they didn't disclose to everyone, not even all Christians, um, that was some of the first stuff that was lost in the apostasy. Okay. So so anyway, that was why I brought up that stuff about the secret teaching. Like usually LDS people only bring it up in context of like temple endowment and stuff like that, which it is applicable to, but I think it's also very applicable to like the mechanics of apostasy. How does this happen to the church? You know? All right. So that's all the quotes I had, but do you have any more questions for me?
Yeah, I think that was a really, really good presentation. I guess let me just bring up a few rapid fire questions. So you've already sort of outlined certain unique doctrines or quotes or teaching that we can find from early Christians or early church fathers
Yeah.
that seem to be quite unique to the restoration, such as, some quotes about premortal existence. I don't think you touched on kingdoms of glory, but definitely deification, baptism for the dead, creation out of pre-existing matter, and God having a body as well. I guess I want to get your thoughts on, because I did a bit of research on Gnosticism, and I did some research into this theory because Gnostics claim that they received this secret knowledge that Christ gave to his apostles. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this. Maybe this is even in your book. I've not got this section yet about a secret gospel of Mark and the
Yeah.
Apostle Peter giving some of the secret rituals and secret knowledge to Mark the evangelist, who brought it to Clement of Alexandria. And I believe Clement talks about these things being stolen by like a
Yeah.
Gnostic teacher,
Carpocrates.
and that, because there's many things in these Gnostic rituals that have, particularly the ritual elements, not so much like their content, but have a lot of similarities with things in our endowment. I just want to get your thoughts on that. Of could Jesus have instituted these sacred rituals and the secret knowledge that could have been transmitted from the apostles to Mark to Clement of Alexandria, this branch of Christianity, and then possibly how it could have then spread into Gnosticism.
Yeah, yeah. So the secret gospel of Mark part, so that all we know about it is from this letter that was discovered that's thought to have been from Clement to somebody else. So Clement of Alexandria, so about 180 to 200 or so AD. And he says that there's this other version of Mark that Mark brought to the church in Alexandria where Clement was. And and it's just like Mark's gospel that we're familiar with, except it has some of the more secret stuff in there. And he
Right.
says that they used it um, for people who were being inducted into the great mysteries, right? So so mysteries it could mean some like really heavy, high level teaching, but also it meant a ritual, like an initiation ritual in like that's one of the meanings of the words, right? So what are the great mysteries? What is this rituals? And Clement has some hints about what went on, but it's really unclear what the sort of more like the the people like Clement who the current Christians would be more comfortable with. Let's put it that way. It's really unclear what rituals they had, but it's clear that they did have these other rituals aside from just baptism and the Eucharist, which we would call the sacrament, right? Um, but he says that the Gnostic Carpocrates managed to steal a copy of it, and they have changed it and everything. So yeah, LDS people have said, hey, this is maybe how the Gnostics, which we do know more about some of their rituals, right? Like from the Nag Hammadi library and stuff like that. Um, so um, this is a way that these Gnostic groups could have gotten a hold of some of the true, uh, Christian secret tradition and then modified it for their own purposes. Okay. So if we put that in terms of the ritual, what do we got? Well, we have for a lot of the Gnostic rituals were ritual ascent. Okay. So
Yes.
just like remember when I talked about the ascent apocalypses, which are Jewish and Jewish Christian, okay, from about like 380 or BC to 280 is when they're thought to have been written. But all of those have like this person being guided through the levels of heaven while they're being washed and anointed and clothed like a priest, and they have to go through the different levels and give the signs and passwords or whatever to get past the guardians there, and they go to the heavenly temple and they're in the presence of God and stuff like that, right? So that's that's what a lot of these Gnostic rituals, like in the Pistis Sophia or the Gospel of Philip, seem to have been about, right? And that's what their whole mythology was about. Remember, like I said, the Jewish Christian and Jewish apocalypses were like three heavens. That's thought to be the oldest version, but or seven or 10 or whatever. But then the some of the Gnostics was like, no, there's 365 different heavens. Okay, but the main structure of these rituals and some of the documents that go along with the rituals, like the Gospel of Philip and so on, um, from the Gnostics, they have the same structure as these ascent apocalypses.
Mm.
So what I would say is it's extremely like given what say Ignatius said about what the Christian secret teaching was about, like the structure of the heavens and different orders of angels and stuff like that, he said is what he was not telling the other Christians about. Um, so given that, I would say if the sort of more normal Christians had these other rituals, it seems very likely that they could have been ascent rituals like this that follow, like priestly clothing and anointing and all that up to the temple in heaven in the presence of God and stuff like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Just like the Gnostic ones. And the Gnostics just made it weirder, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And they have even had heavenly marriage and stuff like that as the culmination and so
Yeah,
on.
because I think I remember reading about that in the Gospel of Philip, like the bridal chamber and some sort of a spiritual marriage, but I couldn't find too much on
Yeah.
that.
If
But some
you,
interesting things about like washing and anointings, like the ascension, the ritual hand clasp, and having to provide like signs or tokens or passwords to like heavenly guardians to pass through the veil, and prayer circles as well are in these Gnostic
yeah.
texts as well. Jesus instituting prayer circles, and I remember when I did an episode on it, like you could see a lot of parallels, and like, do you think it grants any weight to a probability or plausibility that perhaps Jesus could have instituted secret rituals that have some resemblances to our temple rituals, to the apostles that were secretly being passed across in early Christianity, or is that too much of a
But
stretch?
no, it's totally plausible. Like if you just look at what Clement said in his letter about the secret gospel of Mark, like like you said, he describes some kind of initiation ritual with the young man in the text. Uh, and he doesn't say much about it, but then he says, "Oh, we use this text with people who are being initiated into the great mysteries, whatever that was, right?" So, um, so yeah, they had they had rituals. Um, the whole structure of the secret teaching, all the written stuff we have about it is this apocalyptic ascent stuff, right? Visions of the different levels of heaven and stuff like that, and like being sort of deified when you to come into the presence of God. Okay. It's all about that. So the idea that there could be a ritual that goes along with it, like lots of scholars have suggested that as a possibility. The Gnostics surely had rituals that went along with their sort of apocalyptic type of documents, right? So the idea that the Christians had it is not far-fetched, or and not. I don't want to exclude Gnostics from Christians, but the ones we most people would consider more Orthodox Christians, the idea that they had something like that they were keeping secret as part of the stuff that they always said they were keeping secret, right? It's totally plausible.
And that's what the Gnostics claim, that they have that secret knowledge that Christ gave to the apostles. And it kind of makes sense that they probably would have got it from somewhere and they've corrupted it and it's their own spin to it. But I found, because I've been doing research in, a series on ancient temple rites, and I did interviews with Jack Bradshaw as well. And
Yep.
I just find it really fascinating, a lot of these similarities. And would you see this as another evidence of something supporting apostasy, but also restoration of temple ordinances we have
Oh yeah.
in the
Yeah,
restoration?
for sure.
That's cool. Maybe we could
It's like and if you think about like where people like so if you take historians like D. Michael Quinn or whatever, so who are somewhat antagonistic to the church or at least like don't believe in it, and they're trying to explain all this stuff away, they'll say, "Oh, he got this from the Masons and this from these people, this from those people, this from." What I'm saying is that all those things that they say were they're taking from this like fringe group over here and these this esoteric group over here and all this place all these places, we can find almost all that stuff in early Jewish Christianity. We can
mm,
trace it back there. Okay. And so whatever survived in whatever form, and even whatever like current symbolism or whatever that Joseph Smith adopted for his own purposes or whatever, clearly he was restoring something, right? He was restoring something that's a lot like a sort of Christianity that's very primitive, but has been left behind by the rest of the Christian world.
yeah, totally got. Do you mind if I unshare, or if you're able to unshare your screen, just maybe this
Oh,
last part we
yep.
could be on full screen. But I remember, so right before I came back to the church, and I had mainly it was mainly spiritual experiences and personal revelations that brought me back. But whenever I was encountering some interesting faithful evidences, I was coming across like Book of Enoch correspondences or Nahum and Bountiful, or looking at the majority of the statements of the three and the eight witnesses and Book of Mormon complexity and all those sorts of things. But I remember I found this a very interesting evidence is not only these unique sort of Latter-day Saint doctrines that we've talked about that we find in early Christianity, not explicitly in the Bible, but also these connections to ancient temple rites as well. And I remember thinking, even as an unbeliever, but that someone could make a plausible case because Joseph is claiming to be restoring things that were lost in Christianity, and seeing connections between our temple ordinances, not just the endowment, but like baptism for the dead and temple sealings as well, to what might have existed in early Christianity as well. No, to your point about people trying to point to, for example, like people have said, well, Emanuel Swedenborg talked about kingdoms of glory, for example. So Joseph
I
could
think
have got
an
that from
idea
his
of
milieu. Hmm?
celestial marriage too.
Yeah. So the question I was going to ask is, how much do you think Joseph could have had access to from his milieu, that we're claiming is, perhaps being restored from Christianity? And how much do you think he could have had access to in some ways? And does that then invalidate, or I'm trying to think of the word, like make it a less good evidence that he's restoring, if that makes sense? Because naturalistically, someone could say like, well, maybe he just came across this in his environment, in his milieu. So really, this undermines the strength of the argument that he's restoring something from early Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. So like like I said, they talk about the possibility of Joseph Smith getting this idea from Swedenborg, this idea from, you know, the the Kabbalah, that idea from Hermetic traditions or whatever, and the Freemason, blah, 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 all these different and each of those has its own specific context, right? So these little elements are embedded in all these different contexts that Joseph
Right.
Smith would have been grabbing
And
them
for
from.
example, with
Right?
Masonry, it's undoubtedly that Masonry was the primary sort of final catalyst for the Temple of Diana. But the big question is, does Masonry have any connection to some of the rites and symbolism and
Yeah,
iconography in early Christianity as well? So it's almost like it's not a problem if he is being influenced or encountering things in his milieu, but it's also what he's doing with it, how he's repurposing or restoring certain
yeah.
elements.
And if you look into like esoteric societies, like secret societies, and like over time, they are constantly borrowing stuff from each other, just like Carpocrates did with the secret gospel of Mark, right? Like
Yeah.
if you want to make your religious rites or whatever seem more mysterious or whatever, well, use like borrow some stuff from somebody who already does that, right? And so like what in masonry, like how far these things go back, I don't know. Like it's really hard to trace a, a pathway that it could have come. But what you can do is say, okay, how much of this can we locate around like this like there aren't very many early Jewish Christian documents out there, right? But we find a lot of this stuff in there. How did Joseph Smith manage to pick from all of these different contexts that he maybe could have, been exposed to in a lot of cases, but there's no real evidence that he was in some cases. Um, how do you pick all that out and put them into a coherent system that would have been to one degree or to some significant degree sort of comfortable in this sort of early Jewish Christian milieu, right? How did he pull that off? Right? That's something that I think um, people who do not believe in the church should have to wrestle with, right?
Yeah.
They should have to try and explain that away. Like I've seen a lot of your podcasts, right? And one thing I like
Oh, you
about,
have. Oh, thanks.
oh yeah, um, that's why I friended you on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, but one thing I've seen you mention a number of times is that like you're really dogged, even to people like me who are pro-church, right? That you'll say, but like a critic might say this, and like you're actually really good at playing devil advocate like that, which I like. Um, but then a lot of times your discussion comes back to the idea that, well, yeah, there's some things that are hard to explain for us, or we like we can come up with an explanation for why the Book of Abraham is like this, or like the relationship between them and the papyri, or whatever. We can come up with ideas, but some they might seem unsatisfying or something like that. So we have a hard time with it,
Yeah, we're
right?
very much on the defense
Yeah.
with certain issues or topics.
Yeah, but then you say, okay, well, we got to look at the other side too. Like, what are things that could be considered evidences for the church that are hard to explain from the other side, right? And there's a lot of those things. Okay, there's always things that can cause you doubt, and there's always things that where there's gray areas, or maybe we don't have the right explanation yet, or whatever from whatever side you're coming from, right? And we just have to deal with that because we're humans. But um, but we have to deal with that and then just look at it in terms of, okay, which side do we think has more evidence? And then also you can think of your own personal experiences and what that gives evidence for, and so on. Um, but I like how you express that, right? It's that you just have to say, okay, what is hard for us to explain and what's hard for them to explain, and look at it that way rather than just focusing on one side.
Yeah, and
So
I think sometimes critics don't always want to fully acknowledge or like I feel like I could admit like there's some topics where maybe the evidence seems more on the critic side or we're definitely more on the defense. But I feel often critics will never admit that. Like it's like very rarely have I heard a critics admit that, oh yeah, the apologists have the stronger argument on this, or I can see why too that seems like plausible evidence, even if they're not
yeah,
fully convinced by it. But I think because I don't think any of this is like proof, but I think it definitely adds plausibility to Joseph's claims to be restoring, like Christ's original church and doctrines which were lost. And then we're seeing some of these things in some early Christian writings, which aren't clearly in the New Testament. It's just interesting what Joseph has done with them. And I think especially the temple rituals is quite fascinating.
yeah, and the mental gymnastics that you have to do to get around the Book of Mormon witnesses, for example, is just astonishing, right?
Yeah.
So yes, there are issues that they have a really hard time explaining away to like I know they probably have some, they're a little bit uncomfortable with it inside when they say it. Just like we're a little bit uncomfortable with some of our explanations of things, of criticisms, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I think because often people will criticize us for doing mental gymnastics. And I totally get with some topics, I feel like that's exactly what I'm doing, trying to figure it out, come up with plausible theories. But what I've said with some things is I also feel like for me to say, leave the church and deny the faith, I also feel like intellectually I need to have plausible explanations for the evidence in favor and not just dismiss it as well. That needs to be taken seriously and taken into account. And with some of them, I find it hard to intellectually like if Joseph is a fraud and he's made all this up, like I don't know if I could just say religious genius or coincidence for some of these things. I
yeah, yeah,
understand those who
exactly.
do, but
Like so, yeah, you can dismiss anything with religious genius or coincidence, right? And we can with dismiss anything with, well, maybe God did it this other way, or something, because
yeah,
we
sure.
can appeal to sort of supernatural things and so on. But yeah, and some things, some topics, we just don't have enough information to make a really good story, you know.
Are
So
there any in terms of like we kind of went through some unique sort of LDS doctrines that we see some quotes on by either early church fathers or early Christians. But are there any others, without elaborating too much in detail, that stick out to you, other than the ones that we've mentioned, that seem to be found in early Christianity?
so so I thought of one. Um, this is what it was from that Clementine Jewish Christian literature, either the Clementine Recognitions or the Clementine Homilies. I can't remember which one.
Something Clementine.
You know how in LDS, well, in the Bible, it says no man has seen God, right? And so people will point to that and say, well, you say Joseph Smith saw God, and et cetera and so forth, right? So, but if you look at what biblical scholars say about that, they're like, well, says stuff like that here and there in the Old and New Testament, but then it has accounts of people who did see God, right? So how do you put those together? It's hard, right? So they'll say, oh, it's not clearly resolved how that fits together. Okay. Now, LDS people, the way we can fit it together is in the book of Moses. So if you remember, Moses is brought into the presence of God.
Right? It's
And
kind of
he has to
transfigured.
be, yeah, he has to be transfigured into sort of a heavenly being, right, in order to withstand the presence of God. And then later Satan appears to him and he's like, "Why should I worship you? I don't have to be transfigured like I was in the presence of God just to be in the presence of you. So be gone, right? And and so our answer to that could be that, well, flesh and blood can't see God, right? So mortal humans can't see God. But if God transforms them into this sort of angelic or divine being temporarily, then they can. Okay. And that explains everything in the Old and New Testaments, all these theophanies, and also the indications that either nobody's seen God, or if a person would see God, they would be fried, basically. Okay.
Right.
Now, this exact same explanation is found in the Clementine literature. Like how can a person see God? Well, they have to be transformed into the nature of light, it says. Okay. So
Mm.
I don't have it memorized, but that's in summary exactly what it says, is that's how a person can see God.
Right in line with
That's
the
weird.
explanation in
That's a weird
Moses.
and specific thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That Joseph Smith came up with in 1830. That's when he wrote the Book of Moses, right?
And I found a
Uh,
very similar verse because it triggered, I think, in Doctrine and Covenants 67. I had read a passage and, yeah, it's verse 10 to 12. So, well, verse 11 says, "For no man has seen God at any time in the flesh, except quickened by the Spirit of God. Neither can any natural man abide the presence of God, neither after the carnal mind," which is very much in line with what it says in the Book of Moses and what you're quoting from Clementine of, what was it, Homilies or whatever it's called.
it was either the recognitions or the homilies. I can't remember which one, but yeah, that's just so weirdly specific, but it also solves all the problems,
It
right?
does, because it makes sense of what about all those passages in the Bible where prophets have seen God or been in the presence of God. And it helps us to interpret, the verses that say, "Oh, well, no man has seen God." It gives that clarification or explanation.
Yeah.
That's
So
cool.
once again, I don't know. I have never seen anyone say that like Joseph Smith could have gotten that idea from this or that source that could have been available to him, right? But once again, even if they find something like that, he plucked that out and at like from the sea of anomalies, right? And put together something that could have been at home in this early Jewish Christian milieu.
Yeah, I know Terrell Givens has used the phrase this inspired syncretist sometimes for Joseph, and people use that to be like, "Oh, well, he just means he's plagiarizing everything from his environment," but not necessarily. But it also doesn't undermine that it could still be a restoration, even if Joseph encountered something in his milieu as well. That doesn't necessarily have to invalidate or undermine that. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you this question. You touched on this at the start, but this is one that's kind of controversial, where we believe that we're the only true and living church.
Mhm.
We believe in Joseph Smith's first vision. He was told to join on the churches. We know what the Lord said about their creeds being an abomination. And I think in another account in 1842, the Lord just says they're believing in incorrect doctrines and none are identified as his church or kingdom. And, we believe there had to be a restoration of priesthood authority. So on the one hand, it's our claim that we believe that we are the Lord's restored church. There was an apostasy, but then some people view it as that's quite superior or quite arrogant. But then I've listened to some maybe more liberal, progressive members see it as like, oh, it doesn't really matter what religion you are. There's no one true church. At the same time, it's like, well, the Lord seems to be saying that this is his only true and living church collectively. But then we also see references, for example, in the Book of Mormon that talks about there's two churches, the Church of the Lamb and the Church of the Devil. And I don't
It's like
think,
everyone who's against
yeah, and I don't
God,
think it
really.
means that everyone who's not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Church of the Devil. And there's lots of references in the Doctrine and Covenants that the Lord seems to have, at least I think individually, a more expansive view of who are his church or who are his people or his disciples.
Yeah.
But as like an institution, this seems to be his only true and living church with that priesthood authority, priesthood keys, and more of a fuller understanding of doctrine. But how do you make sense of that if people say, well, you're arrogant, and that's very superior to say that we're the only true and living church?
Well, well, you remember we started out this whole thing talking specifically about, okay, here's what we don't mean by that, right? So I would make sure they understand that. And if they still have that problem, usually it's coming from people that don't really have any strong beliefs, but maybe they have some vaguely held opinion, but they kind of think that well, they get mad if somebody has a strongly held opinion, right? And because that invalidates their weakly held opinion or something like that, right? So usually for me, the people I've met, if they have like that they're really strong Catholic or something like that, they actually kind of respect the idea that we're like, yeah, we're we're the true church, not you, right? And they're like, no, we're the true church, not you. And then we can talk about what we have in common and what our differences are, but people don't get mad about it. The people who get mad about it are the ones that just don't want their opinions challenged at all. You see what I mean? So even the more liberal Latter-day Saints that you were talking about, they've sort of bought into that cultural thing where it's like nobody has all the truth, and so everything's up in the air. You know, it's don't know everything, so we can't know anything type of thing, right?
Mm,
And so they'll buy into that sort of ethos of everyone should just not just respect others' rights to have different opinions and try and find common ground and so on, but actually not at least pretend not to have any strong opinions, and so we never argue about anything. I don't know. That's how I frame it in my mind. So I
yeah.
don't
And
I don't
I one thing I like as well about like our church, while that can come across superior or elite, I think is often how we express it. Like I've read quotes where the church has said about some of the great religious leaders of other religions, like Muhammad and others, that they may have been inspired and believing that they also God could have communicated with them and they had a portion of his light and truth, and that there's goodness in other sacred texts or those Christians who are following Christ, that they're sincerely following him. And we don't believe that we're going to be the only ones who will be in heaven or be in the presence of God. Because often when you know, say, look at what other religions say about Mormons, it's like, well, they're going to hell. You know, it's a false gospel, a different Jesus. And that's one thing I actually appreciate is we can see the good and the truth and recognize that people in other religions might have genuine spiritual experiences and connection to God. And we shouldn't think that even though we believe as an institution that ours is authorized and we have maybe a fuller understanding of God's plan and doctrine, that we are the only ones who are have that close relationship with God or will return back to be in his presence.
yeah, yeah. And so if somebody does tell me, and a lot of people have, that they think I'm going to hell because of my beliefs or whatever, right? Um, I don't care. Like, it doesn't matter to me because I have strongly held beliefs too. And so I can just say, well, that's fine. You believe whatever you want about that. Here's how I feel about what your prospects, right? And, but it doesn't matter to me, you know, and I don't think it should matter to anyone. And so when I'm faced with that, I just try and express that to them that like, look, you're getting too offended by just people having different opinions than you. That's not healthy.
Yeah, and one thing I love about our theology is that it's actually quite expansive and inclusive, particularly our beliefs in the afterlife and the gospel being preached to those in the spirit world, those who don't have the opportunity to accept it or who don't accept it in this life. And we don't believe that people are condemned just for having an incorrect theology, but it's more them living true to whatever light and knowledge that they've been given. And we're just wanting to add to that and almost to celebrate the good beliefs and morals that they do have as well.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, I want to ask you one final question because we've been going about 3 hours, and I've really enjoyed this interview. If I'm still
Yeah, me too.
energetic after 3 hours, it was a good episode. I guess I'll just finish with maybe you could summarize why you find the claims of the restoration of the gospel in the church compelling and why you are a believer in the foundational truth claims of the restoration.
Well, in terms of why I'm a believer, it's because of like experiences I've had, right? And that I don't want to say I can't explain away, but I don't choose to explain away, right? And on the intellectuals, I'm sort of like you expressed before. I'm the similar kind of person where I kind of do have to have some plausible story in my head, otherwise I obsess over it or whatever. But I think it can be done, right? Like, yeah, there's gray areas, there's things that we probably don't have the the right story yet to explain everything, but but if I think just intellectually about um, you know, the idea of rejecting the claims of the church and Joseph Smith and all that, um, it's too hard, you know. Like the criticisms I can explain, you know, sort of to my satisfaction, explaining the Book of Mormon witnesses and explaining, how Joseph Smith could have zeroed in on early Jewish Christianity when he's claiming to restore primitive Christianity, basically, and like a bunch of other stuff. I just would have a too hard of a time explaining that away. It just especially given my own personal experiences, I I I don't think I could do that in a satisfying way for myself.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I'm really grateful for you coming on and doing this interview with me. I think it's been a great discussion. I will recommend to listeners go buy this book, Restoring the Ancient Church, Joseph Smith and Early Christianity. I think this is probably one of the best books you'll get on this topic. It's got great summaries of apostasy, restoration, what's been happening in early Christian history, and the unique doctrines and practices restored as well. I think it's a great book. So go check it out and buy it and read through it as well. And thank you so much for coming on, Barry.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this, give it a like, comment, share as well, subscribe so you don't miss out on future interviews with great guests and people like Barry. And if you care to donate to support me in the work that I'm doing, you can buy a PayPal, Patreon, or GoFundMe as well. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.